Mark 1. Conversations at the Speed of Sound. Members of the Aviation Historical Society are embarrassed. They are the proud owners of one Canberra jet bomber, but they have nowhere to put it. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mac 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. My name is Gary Hills. I am a QAM volunteer, I'm happy to say, and I will be your host for this episode, this penultimate episode for Season 1. That's right, episode 15. Next week will be the final episode for this season. I'll let you know more about that later. But in this episode, you will hear all about the beginning of the Queensland Air Museum. And what strikes me about this story is the tenacity and optimism evident in that small, determined band of people with no funds who believed in establishing a People's Aviation Museum. I was so thrilled to be able to sit down and talk with a founding member, Mr. Ron Cuskelly. What I just read to you was the opening sentence from a banner news item published in the Courier Mail on Saturday, the 29th of December 1973, under the headline, "A Bomber with Nowhere to Go." After that opening paragraph, the journalist, Mr. Alan Underwood, continued. They have paid $1,360 for the Air Force machine. Their deadline for taking it away from Amberley Air Base expired on December the 19th. The bomber still is on the RAAF base. The Society faces three major problems. 1. Where to take the aircraft. 2. How to transport the 19.8-metre machine from Amberley to wherever it has to go. And 3. What to do with 7,728 litres of kerosene still in the aircraft tanks. Now, Ron Cuskelly is the Queensland Air Museum historian, but his knowledge of the history of the QAM is very personal because Ron is one of the QAM's founding members. Ron joined Qantas straight out of high school in 1968 and became a load controller at Brisbane Airport, responsible for weight and balance of aircraft loads. He did that until 1999. Ron and I sat down together recently in Hangar 2, where the Canberra, number 225, is currently proudly displayed, and I asked Ron to take us back to the period leading up to the establishment of the Air Museum in 1974.
Yes, well, I think a lot of people don't realise that we had to create an organisation to create the organisation. And it kicked off in 1970 when the local manager in Brisbane of Thomas Cook's travel agency, he was a member of the Aviation Historical Society of Australia, and Brian Eggleton decided there should be a Queensland chapter of the AHSA. So he contacted all the current members, and we had a meeting in his flat back in 1970. And it was agreed that we'd take the plunge and form a local branch. And we had our first meeting in Qantas House in Queen Street the next month. And that kept going mainly as a social activity, showing films, and we had some very interesting guest speakers come along, but the numbers were small. That organisation is still operating, but really the emphasis moved to actually preserving aircraft, and that's when we had to form another organisation to create a museum. And we eventually decided on a a name that was quite a mouthful. We were calling ourselves the Aviation Historical Society of Australia Limited, Queensland Branch Aviation Museum Group.
It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it, Ron?
Yeah, and that we selected that name in 1973, but it didn't take much longer. It was only the next month that we started using the name Queensland Air Museum, and our first foray into the preservation came at the time when the Commonwealth Government were disposing of Canberra bombers. There were 17 of them up for sale at Amberley RAF base. So we decided amongst us that yes, we should submit a tender, and all we could afford was a nominal tender of $1. But we figured it wouldn't be accepted, and indeed it wasn't. But the objective was to get our name on the books, to let the authorities know what a serious contender we were. But there was a lot of toing and froing after that nominal tender, and eventually the Department of Supply, as it was then, got back to us and offered us a Canberra if we could increase our offer somewhat. And the price they put on it was $1,360. Not a lot for an aeroplane, but in 1973 it was a substantial amount of money, and the organisation didn't have any. So 3 of our founding members contributed loans to enable the tender to go through, and we then had the predicament of finding somewhere to put our Canberra bomber. So our then President, Richard Hitchens, contacted the aviation writer at the Courier Mail to see if he could stir up a bit of publicity for us. And indeed, publicity is what we got, because we got a banner headline across the front page of the Courier Mail immediately below their masthead. So money can't buy a position like that. So the headline was "A Bomber with Nowhere to Go."
Now, for our listeners, the Canberra was twin-engine jet bomber, served with the Australian Air Force. Just talk us through, like, it sounds to me, you make it sound rather simple, expensive, but simple, to the Department of Supply say we're shedding these aircraft, anybody who wants one, they can have one. What kind of restrictions or requirements were placed upon you as part of the arrangement to take charge of this aircraft?
Well, the most stringent requirement was that we had to move it out of Amberley by a certain date. And as that date was approaching, we had an event in history which is remembered as the Australia Day floods. This was 1974. So we had to seek an extension, which we got. And all this time we're evaluating all the offers of sites that came in through all the newspaper publicity. And eventually we decided on a site at Currabee on the south of Brisbane, where the Hunter family, who were the garbage contractors to the Brisbane City Council, they were developing a museum of horse-drawn vehicles. And they wanted an attraction to go at the front of their premises to draw attraction to the museum, and they saw our problem, so they invited us to put the Canberra on their property at Currabee. So we agreed to that. It seemed like an ideal place to start a museum, and we set about dismantling the Canberra. And to that end we had some assistance from the RAAF. They were very good. They assigned a senior NCO to assist us, and comical event when this NCO turned up, his name was Sergeant Overall. And of course he had his name patch on his overalls which said Overall. And one of our founding members at the time, Barry Flood, was tempted to turn up at Amberley with a shirt with a patch on it saying shirt, but it never went that far. But they were very good to us. And
so you have to dismantle it and put it on trucks. Does your team have experience with this kind of a project?
None whatsoever. No.
Or the tools, or the...
We were totally green, but we were convinced there should be an aviation museum for the people of Queensland. It wasn't to be a private collection. So we set about dismantling this Canberra, and first of all we had to remove quite a lot of jet fuel from it. That was pumped into 44-gallon drums, and that was given away to a local farmer who used it for weed killer.
Okay.
So then we set about dismantling the aeroplane itself, and we used, at the recommendation of the RAF, we used a method that hadn't been tried before. Normally they would take the wings off, but the RAF suggested we try removing the forward fuselage and the rear fuselage, and because there were transport joints in the aeroplane there, but it meant removing hundreds of bolts. But and then you would transport the entire wingspan with the engines fitted on a low loader, and it was a horrendous looking load, but it was balanced and it worked, and that's how we transported the Canberra to Currabee.
Did you have any assistance with reassembly, or did you basically were left on your own at that point?
No, well, having dismantled it, that taught us how to reassemble it, so that wasn't such a problem for us. But we had to go and seek assistance from transport companies, and to that end Brambles were very good to us. They gave us a good deal.
Now, so you've mentioned Currabee and the bomber with nowhere to go. I think between 1973, which is what we're talking at this point, and 1986, the collection grew, but also the need for a location was a constant challenge. Is that right?
Well, it was, because we thought we had it made with the move to Currabee, but sadly that collection went into liquidation and we had to move. And the best we could find was a former orchard at Lower Nudgee, which is not far from Brisbane Airport. And we were given a grazing lease on this site, where our aeroplanes grazed for a number of years. By this time we had the Canberra, we had a Meteor, which was actually flown into Archerfield on delivery. It had been in service as a target tug out at Woomera, and that was an outright gift from the British Ministry of Defence. They flew the aeroplane from Woomera to Archerfield and handed us the keys. It was unfortunate in one respect, because the pilot who flew the aeroplane over was on the verge of retirement, and he was hoping to do a small aerobatic display over Archerfield on arrival. But it wasn't to be, because the Meteor has a ventral fuel tank, and the valve to the tank was stuck, so he couldn't access the fuel, and was on the verge of declaring an emergency and diverting to Amberley, which wouldn't have done us any good. But he had just enough fuel to get into Archerfield, but unfortunately no aerobatic display to close out his career.
And so by this stage you have the Canberra, you have the Meteor TT20. Was that the entire collection at that point?
With the Sea Venom, yes.
Sea Venom.
Yeah. Once we'd moved all the aircraft down to Nudgee, it was a pretty remote site. There wasn't a lot of tourism traffic down that way. But we'd always wanted to be on an airport. We thought that was the logical place for an air museum. We were hoping to have a site at Archerfield near the Aero Club, but although the Aero Club was very supportive, the Commonwealth Government demanded rental fees that were beyond us. So we're at Nudgee, always wanting to be on an airport, and not long after we moved in we found out that we weren't going to an airport was coming to us. They were redeveloping Brisbane Airport, and our site was going to be part of the floodway.
Right.
So we were then faced with moving the aircraft again, and it got a rather serious situation with a lot of correspondence with the federal government, and eventually I think our president threatened to donate the collection to the government, and that forced their hand, and they found what they called a temporary holding area on Brisbane Airport, adjacent to the old cross runway there. And we set about moving the Canberra for the third time onto this temporary holding area, which we weren't permitted to open to the public, so it wasn't a very satisfactory arrangement for us.
And I think at some point in this part of the story there was a connection with Tahiti. Is that right?
Yes, we were contacted by a pilot in Tahiti whose father had owned a Sandringham flying boat, which once belonged to Sir Gordon Taylor. It was his frigate Bird 3. And Sir Gordon Taylor sold the aeroplane to this airline in Tahiti, and they used it for many years on passenger services until it was withdrawn from service, and the owner contacted us and asked us if we wanted it, which of course we did. Not only was it a significant type of aircraft, it had a very famous connection. So we set about trying to fund transportation from Tahiti to Australia, and we didn't have much success with that. But we did send several of our members over to Tahiti. They did some repairs on the aircraft. They repaired its beaching gear. They washed the aircraft and painted it where the paint had peeled off. So they did a lot and repaired broken windows and things like that. So that was an interim measure, but not long after that the writing was on the wall that we couldn't get the finance to transport it. And then we had a request from the Musée de l'Air in Paris. They expressed an interest in the aeroplane because it was last on the French register in Tahiti. And we happily relinquished ownership to them, and in due course they dismantled the aircraft and transported it to Paris, where it's on display now. So the aeroplane was saved, it wasn't a total loss.
Picture yourself strapped into the pilot seat of an F-111 strike aircraft. Introducing the Queensland Air Museum's ultimate F-111 experience. Spend a couple of hours with our guides, RAAF Air Vice Marshal retired David Dunlop and Air Commodore retired Peter Growder, who will take you through the experience in a clear, easy to understand and highly enjoyable manner. After a mission briefing, you'll be introduced to the aircraft features and controls before strapping into the cockpit to go through your checklist procedures. Bookings are restricted to a maximum of 2 people in a group, so personal attention is assured. The ultimate F-111 experience. Costs and booking details are available on the Queensland Air Museum website. You keep using the word we. Just tell us how many people you're talking about here. How big was your membership? What kind of resources did you have at this time?
Well, virtually nothing. Members, active members, probably a dozen. Certainly no funds. It was beg, borrow and steal.
Including the option for a location, which is still really unsettled, isn't it, for you?
Yes, we're still on this temporary holding area at Brisbane Airport and hoping for something better. And one day our President, Richard Hitchens, was getting ready to go to work in the morning, and he received a telephone call from the Regional Director of the Department of Civil Aviation saying, I want you out at your aeroplane at the airport straight away. I can't tell you what it's about. So he got in his car and went out to the airport.
So this is the Canberra he's talking about?
Yeah. And it turned out that someone had fired a projectile at the Canberra. Actually hit the aircraft. It made a hole in the bomb bay door. And this was intended as a demonstration of what an extortionist would do to a TAA aircraft if he was not paid a significant amount of money. So we were now embroiled in a criminal case that brought world headlines. eventually, I believe they apprehended the individual, and the damaged bomb door was removed from the aeroplane as evidence, and it finished up at Amberley, and the RAF gave us the choice of would you like us to repair it, or would you like us to give you a new one? So we thought, well, the one with the hole in it's got more history now, so just patch it up for us and we'll have it back. So that was the highlight of our time on Brisbane Airport. Around this time, we had, it wasn't just the aircraft, we had engines and other components, and they were scattered all over the country. We had material in a DCA shed at Navy Street near the airport. We had items in a Queensland government shed up at Wivenhoe Dam. We had our library in an office in George Street in the city, which was given to us by the Queensland government. We had an aircraft in the wool sheds down at Hendra. We had an aircraft at the Royal Queensland Aero Club at Archerfield, and a lot of stuff in members' houses. So we really needed a home. Another funny incident happened while we were at Brisbane Airport. We knew we'd have to move out of there, so every time you move aeroplanes you need lots of tyres, old tyres for packing. And for one of the aircraft we needed specifically 2 large truck tyres. So we put out a request to a local tyre dealer for 2 truck tyres. And the next time we turned up at the airport, there was this vast mound of tyres next to the aircraft. What we got were 2 truckloads of tyres. And in those days, it was common to use old tyres on practice fires for the fire services at the airport. But this was also around the time that the practice was banned. So there was a particularly bad smell about old tyres at that time, and this came to the attention of the Minister for Civil Aviation, or he was Minister for Transport then, I think, and we didn't have a very happy relationship with this man, but he got to see, he visited Brisbane Airport on an inspection, and he saw this vast mound of tyres there, and apparently he blew his top. So we eventually got notice that our permissive occupancy at Brisbane Airport would cease, and we'd have to find a new home.
Can I ask, I'm just sitting here thinking about what it must have been like through those early years. You had so many uncertainties, so many challenges, so few resources, so few members. Were there times when you felt that this just wasn't worth it, or did you have a certainty that this was worth persisting with?
Well, we were determined that Queensland should have an aviation museum, and it was always proposed that it would be the People's Museum. It's not a private collection, and there was nothing in southeast Queensland at the time, and it's a tribute to the early members that they persevered with this concept. But we, as a result of our eviction from Brisbane Airport, we again called upon the media for publicity, and before long we had offers of several sites. They were Caloundra, Redcliffe, Caboolture, Gold Coast, Toowoomba, and even an offer from Longreach. And to his lasting credit, Councillor John Harrison from what was then the Landsborough Shire Council, it's now the Caloundra Council, he saw the benefit in having an aviation museum on the Sunshine Coast, and he contacted us and made an offer of a site on Caloundra Aerodrome. But around the same time, we had another offer from Caboolture, which was much closer to all our members. They were Brisbane based, and we'd virtually decided that Caboolture was the best place for us to go. But then again, to his great credit, Councillor John Harrison lobbied the council and dipped into his tourism budget, and he upped the ante by offering a building, which is our hangar number 1, which is where we now house our F-111.
So this is 1986?
1986, yes.
And at that point, how large was the collection? How many aircraft and engines would you have had at that point to relocate?
Well, engines probably 10 or so, but aircraft, we had the Canberra, the Meteor, 2 Sea Venoms by then, and a Drover.
So then came the task. You've got a location, you've got a hangar, which is gold, and you have to relocate the collection to here. This is the same small group of people. You have to dismantle, you have to truck, you have to reassemble. Is that the process? Just getting everything here?
Yeah, it was repeat the process, and we moved smaller items over several weeks. We had some material stored in an empty service station in Bullcock Street. That was another temporary site. But once the building was ready, we had an overnight convoy to move 3 aeroplanes at once. We moved the Canberra, the Meteor and the Sea Venom overnight, and they arrived up here in June 86. After we'd moved here, we then began recruiting local volunteers, and we always saw the Sunshine Coast as that was one of its biggest selling points. There were a lot of retired people here, a lot of them from airlines and Air Force and so forth. And sure enough, they soon started gravitating to the museum, and we built up a good team of volunteer workers.
And you've managed to find a location within an airport precinct, which is perfect. We've got aircraft being able to be delivered here, haven't we? Like the Wirraway, for example, which flew in here as part of the acquisition of that aircraft. And as you say, there are now a larger and perhaps more diverse group of people who are able to volunteer here and support the effort. The opening ceremony must have been quite something for you in 1987.
Yes, it was very emotional actually for multiple reasons. Our patron around the time was Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, famous Queensland aviator. And at one stage when we told him that we'd secured a permanent site at Caloundra, we asked him would he be able to come for the opening ceremony, and he said he'd get there if he had to walk. But sadly, that never came to pass because Don Bennett passed away suddenly. His lovely wife, Lee Bennett, agreed to come out here to unveil the museum, and that happened on the 4th of April 1987, by which time we'd moved the Canberra 4 times. So we were determined that Caloundra is going to be our permanent home. We've got no intention of moving anywhere else.
And you know, I first came in here as a visitor, I think in the late 1980s, not long after I was a boy, we were on holidays. I was absolutely captivated by the display here as an aviation enthusiast myself. And I've come back many times over the years, and the collection has grown, hasn't it? It's incredible to see it today, and it's a fantastic credit to everyone who was involved to bring this idea into being, into fruition. And it kind of makes me a little emotional even to think about it, because of the importance of a place like this for the history as well as the future, I think, of our people, of our country. And so, we can sit here today in Hangar 2, right almost under the wings of the Canberra, where there's a repaired bullet hole in the bomb bay door, and we're surrounded by, a great collection of aircraft, military and civil, on a property of 6 acres, 2 hectares, with 2 hangars, multiple workshops. It's just a marvellous story, Ron, and I would like to ask you if it's possible to continue this story at another time. I would love to hear how it got from that opening ceremony to the way it is today. And I'd be particularly interested, if you're interested in sharing your thoughts about where the future might be for the Queensland Air Museum too, because it's not over yet, is it?
Well, the interesting thing is, not long after we opened here in Caloundra, we set up a visitor's book near the front door. And we got lots of interesting comments in the visitor's book. But one that really stuck in my mind was, "Will be good when it's finished."
That's
I can't
interesting.
imagine that it ever will be finished.
And let's hope it's never finished, because that's a good thing, isn't it? Thank you so much, Ron Cuskelly. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we can talk further. But thank you for talking to me today.
Yeah, happy to do that, Gary.
Will be good when it's finished. That is quite thought-provoking, is it not? And we, of course, hope that the Queensland Air Museum will never be finished. To me, as a volunteer in the present, surrounded by 100 or so volunteers, we're all volunteers at the QAM, there is a sense of optimism and enthusiasm for a future for this museum. And we are going to end our first season of Mac 1 next week by exploring something of that future with the current QAM president, Bill Trail, and a couple of other people who I know you'll find interesting. An aerospace scientist, for example, who I bumped into wandering around taking in our collection not long ago, and also an instructor in aerospace futures. So that's next week. Don't forget you can share in the conversation by commenting and viewing photos and videos of our episodes in the Mac 1 Hangar on wordpress.com. And please, if you believe in the usefulness and the quality of this podcast, it would help a lot for you to give us a rating, a good rating, of course, and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice so that others may too join our community of enthusiasts keen to continue the preservation of Australia's aviation heritage. And if you can, come and visit us in Pathfinder Drive, Caloundra. We're open from 10 until 4 every day except Christmas Day and Easter Friday. Come and see us soon.